Hello, and welcome to Connected Learning TV. This is our 23rd webinar in the series, and to date, we've been viewed in over 85 countries. Today's guest speaker is going to be Elyse Eidman-Aadahl. She's going to be talking about communities of practice for professional learning, connected learning for adults. Can the concept of communities of practice help frame connected learning in the workplace and beyond? Elyse Eidman-Aadahl directs national programs and site development for the National Writing Project, a 38-year-old national network of nearly 200 university-based sites known for a distinctive model of professional learning for educators. Eidman-Aadahl designs and facilitates inquiry networks for practitioners focused on the teaching of writing, digital literacy, and youth development. And we have some guests with us today, some respondents. We're going to have a pretty lively conversation. So I'm going to ask the respondents to briefly introduce yourselves, and then we're going to turn it over to Elyse for a brief presentation, and then we're going to converse. So why don't we start with you, Fred?
Thanks, Howard. My name is Fred Mindlin. I'm the Associate Director for Technology Integration with the Central California Writing Project, the local project based at the University of California at Santa Cruz.
And I'm Kim Jackson, and I'm an assistant professor at California State University, Chico.
Hi, I'm Lacey Manship, and I'm Associate Director of the UNC Charlotte Writing Project in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Hi, I'm Tanae Gray from the Digital Youth Network, and I'm the Director of Professional Development as well as programming.
Okay, so take it away, Elyse.
Great, thank you, Howard. And hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. I think that first I want to say that all the folks who are on the program today are part of and practitioners of the general area I want to talk about. What I really wanted to do was to open up a series of questions that we might want to think about for those of us that are concerned about or thinking about the practice of connected learning. So I'm going to kick up some slides just to get us started, and apologies for the minute that'll take me to get that going. Desktop there. And since I won't be able to see you all, I'm hoping that you see my slides. Is that the case, folks? Okay. So part of what I'm going to do today, and I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So part of what I wanted to do today was actually really think about bringing together two communities and two sets of questions. Certainly this set of webinars has been focused on this issue of this model of connected learning, and probably people who have been watching these webinars are really familiar with this concept of connected learning as a model of learning that's interest-powered, peer-supported, academically oriented. We're familiar with this diagram here that kind of lays out some thinking of connected learning that really comes from observing learners out in the world and seeing how they power, really, their learning for themselves. And from connected learning, we've been trying to take some lessons for those of us that are practitioners, teachers, mentors, and others, about what that might mean for our practice if we wanted to foster connected learning. And then the other thing that I wanted to bring together with this model is that we are this month celebrating Connected Educator Month. And Connected Educator Month is a much larger initiative that cuts across lots of different folks, trying to support practitioners, educators of all sorts in getting connected. And this phrase online communities of practice keeps coming up. The learning affordances we have because we as educators have an opportunity to get connected, in effect. So what I really wanted to do in this webinar was invite us all to think about bringing these two strands together. And I'm thinking back to just last week when Connie Yao was on Connected Learning.
Elyse, forgive me for interrupting, but I'm getting a message that people on live stream are not seeing your slides. So can you I'm sorry. Can you start again, but don't put it in full screen mode?
Oh, okay. Let's see. I'm not sure then if that's what will happen with the animation then. Let's try. Okay, folks, so we'll do it from this one screen. I think I can try it again, and just know that they were fabulously animated, and they might not be. Okay, how is that? Are people able to see that? Okay, thanks. I'm sorry, and I couldn't see, so I appreciate you all verbally pulling me in. So, Connected Learning Month, Connected Learning is a model. Connected Educator Month. And here, thinking back to Connie Yao's talk just last week about connected learning, she was on along with Marcia Semmel from IMLS and others. And one of the things that she mentioned was, we're really going to pursue connected learning. We need to reimagine our learning institutions where many of the resources for learning lie. And there was a discussion about what that would mean for the learning institutions like libraries, museums, schools, higher ed institutions. And I just want to say there's a lot of them. This is a rough picture of how many just learning institutions we might be talking about in this nation. And there's, of course, then hundreds of more places where kids learn online or when they learn in after-school clubs, practitioners in the informal space. But that question, reimagining our learning institutions, is huge. And I put these numbers up not so much to talk about scale or raise the question, how do we reach all these places? But I actually want to go with another direction. I want to be able to say that these institutions, for millions of adults, are actually workplaces. We talk about them as learning institutions. They get this sort of glow around them as if they are places where everyone learns. But for some people, they're actually the places where they work. Designing, facilitating, assessing learning is their job. And I want to really emphasize that, their actual job. So there's a piece of this that is actually about workplace learning. And I don't think that's a language that we often bring into the conversation about connected learning. We're focusing very much, I am as well as an educator, on what it means for youth. But what I wanted to do today was just open up this question of what connected learning means for the adults who are in the same spaces with young people. And who, just like we say of young people, it's challenging to imagine connected learning in the boundaries of school. What's it like to imagine connected learning for adults within the boundaries of the workplace? They're often the same place. So that's sort of the question. And I think it's really important because as a society, the we is kind of the global we. We're in a real mess about what workplace learning means. About how workers learn, about how people learn on the job, about whether they're allowed to be learners. And we have this legacy, I think, of some really strong images of what workplace thinking and learning is about. And here are some of them. We certainly have a strong model in many workplaces that management, whoever that is, or research is going to come up with all the ideas, and workers carry them out. So there's this long kind of Fordist tradition of separating the head and the hand, people who do work will say, of putting those in two different places and giving the thinking to some role and the execution to another. And I think for a lot of workers, this is actually still their life. This is still a very viable and strong model in a lot of workplaces. And so actually a lot of the young people we might be thinking about in terms of connected learning are surrounded by adults whose life experience is not that during the boundaries of their workday, they're invited to be learners. We have that kind of old bargain that we've actually made in a lot of workplace settings or with a lot of job categories. It kind of says, give us your whatever 8 hours, do what you're told. On your weekends and on your evenings, in your hobbies, in your vacations, in your leisure, you can do or be whatever you want. You can do or be a learner there. But for 8 hours, you're going to sort of do what you're told. We have another model that would pretty much say assessment is going to figure out who's good and who's bad. We're going to find out who the bad workers are. They're not meeting their quotas, their targets. Out they go. Let's replace them with better ones. And the kind of the learning model there is you do it before you come in, or you invest in it as an individual to upgrade a skill or a capacity. And then in the workplace, you compete for slots, in effect. It's not a model that invests in everybody being a learner. It's a model that puts a competitive frame around people who are supposed to be learning someplace else. And then, of course, a lot of us, I mean, I would say it's even true of my work, you know, we're involved in systems development or technology development that really does let us bypass workers in a lot of ways. That's been part of the efficiency argument of so many businesses. One of the ways that we can reduce costs is to reduce salary costs. So an investment in systems development lets us be efficient with fewer people involved in work. And I would say all of these, in a way, are true models that are experienced even by people who are sort of in the professions. It's certainly true of educators. It's certainly true of people in museum education, library education. They may experience all of this. We're in a huge conversation right now about, for example, bad teachers and good teachers. Can we assess our way out of bad teachers and find some better ones? We certainly have models of teacher-proof curriculum where someone invents them and then they're implemented by kids, by teachers and youth. And then there's a whole sort of model about, you know, can we go around teachers who may not be effective or mentors who may not be effective and just put learning systems in place. And I certainly would advocate that young people ought to be able to access learning unmediated by adults and teachers. I'm actually in favor of that. But as a model for investing in worker learning or in practitioner learning, that might lead us to be disincentivized in terms of investing in learning. So I think we're in many ways a mess when we shift to the workplace about what it means for adults to learn. And I think this is hugely, hugely important because I think we can't really expect young people to become powerful learners if they're not surrounded by adults who are powerful learners, who are invited to learn, who express the capacities to learn and the interests and the dispositions of a learner. And if young people are going to be in institutions like schools or other learning institutions for huge parts of their life, if they see those places and those people as unengaged and disempowered learners, that's a pretty powerful statement. So what I want to say is I think for any of us who are committed to connected learning for youth, and maybe the youth are our focus of our work, that we have to at least be also committed to connecting learning for adults. Apologies for that background there. That'll go down the street. It's going to be not possible to achieve what we want to achieve in terms of a learning society by just focusing on the next generation and trying to fix it for them and not fix it for the young people who are, for the adults who are building and running the world right now. So that's the question I want to call, and just a couple more slides and I want to kick it over for a discussion. I think one of the great things, I think this is a positive moment to call this question, because if we look at connected learning, there's nothing about it that is youth only focused. It's a model of learning that adults engage in as well. And we take sort of these classic characteristics of connected learning that we keep talking about: interest-powered, peer-supported, academically oriented learning.
Well, apparently we're getting the black screen again. I think you jumped to full screen some way. I'm not sure, but
Yeah, I'm not sure what to say. It's on the little thumbnail. It looks like okay.
oh, okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
Maybe a lag, maybe a lag, John. Anyway, so if we think of connected learning, we keep talking about these characteristics: interest-powered, peer-supported, academically oriented. And we argue that, you know, however it is to pull that off, we think it's a really powerful model of learning. We think that more learning occurs in a context like this. And I think in practitioner learning, and all the folks who are guests today have been part of practitioner learning communities, I think there's an exact analog. There are traditions in practitioner or worker learning. They have some history and some shape to them, and they are very analogous to how we talk about connected learning. Interest-driven, I would say inquiry-driven, is something that you hear a lot about in practitioner learning circles. Peer-supported, you hear about colleague-supported or colleague-engaged adult learning. Academically oriented, well, you hear a lot about improvement-oriented. And much like we'd say of academics, we mean the really best vision of academics. We mean the really best vision of improvement as well. Not sort of mere efficiency, but, you know, really taking your job, your profession, your role in society and moving it towards something more powerful and more good. And I think that produces very strong learning for adults. And just a couple of quick slides of what that can look like. There are all these traditions in practitioner learning that come up again and again. Communities of practice showed up in the online communities of practice phrase. You hear a lot about practitioner research, practitioner inquiry groups. Action research shows up a lot as a method for practitioners to learn. Social learning models, the phrase critical friendship. Networked improvement teams comes up a lot in healthcare and medicine, nursing education, and health improvement. I would say that design thinking in some ways, which many people are right now looking at as a very strong way for people to work together in the workplace to inspire creativity and learning, has a lot of these same characteristics. And part of what's true of all these approaches is that they're often very much led by, designed by, invested in practitioners themselves. So just like we might say, you know, when youth can lead and help build a learning environment that works for them, it's a powerful one. And the same thing can be true for adults in the workplace, when they really can design for their own learning. And these are all approaches that have a really strong practitioner and worker base in designing how they work. So here's where I wish I had some animation, but I wanted to say part of what's true about all of these in this very text-heavy slide. When I say putting practice at the center, I think all of these approaches in workplace learning have a very rich view of what it means to do practice, what practice is. And without this rich view, I think we make a lot of mistakes in designing learning environments. And so just some of them that I would want to note here. Thinking right now about practitioners, for example, who work with youth. Well, first off, they perform that practice. If you picture a teacher or a mentor in a U Media Center, they're on their feet interacting with young people. It's active, it's embodied, it's performed. You're over here in a corner talking to a young person, and back in the other corner something's happening. Do you see it? Do you not see it? Do you stop interacting with this kid and pay attention to that? Where does the time go? Do you even remember what happened during the day? All these kinds of issues. If we're going to learn from our practice, we have to remember that practice happens. It's an event. It's performed. And how do we even hold on to it and see it to learn from it? So that's one element. Practice is always situated in a real place with, real dimensions, other people involved, the shape of the institution, the moment of the day, whether a siren goes by like it just did, all this other kind of stuff. It's always situated, it's located in some place. It's always really multidimensional too. An example, you're working with a young person let's say you're in a U Media Center, you walk by and here's a young person who's been working on audio and video editing. You're really excited, that person's getting engaged, you're a mentor for them. Up on the screen, you see a wonderful piece that they have just dived into. It's fabulous. It has this interesting element which feels to you a little bit sexist, let's say, and it's blaring into the space. And you know, around you there are other people who are being made uncomfortable by this. How are you going to intervene? Are you going to intervene? Do you attend to the young person creating it? Do you attend to the fact of what he or she does or doesn't know about the video? Do you attend to everyone else in the space being made comfortable or uncomfortable? All of those things are multidimensional for a practitioner at any given moment. The commitment to the youth, the commitment to a safe space. So there's really no time that you can isolate practice and say, I'm just going to look at it through this one lens, because everything is always happening at once in practice. Practice is always located in an institution. You're a teacher. There are expectations for you in your role. There are other professionals in the space that you interact with. If you keep your students late from class, then you're interfering with some other practitioner who's waiting for some young people to show up in class. So you're always located in some institution that is way bigger than you. Practice is always framed by expectations. If you're a teacher, society has a role for you. It expects things of you. You walk in the room and you meet some young people, and you can't just say to them, I'm different. I'm not like any other teacher you know. They're carrying images of teacherness, as are their parents, as are you. So it's always framed. It accumulates over time. You have previous solutions that you're holding on to that you keep using, that you have to keep questioning. And then a bunch of that gets out of your tacit awareness. So even how do you exhume a lot of that to think about it when a lot of your professional practice requires you to act and forget how complex everything is, or else you'd be paralyzed. So I think all of these elements of practice, all of our approaches to practitioner learning assume that we have to create spaces for adults to learn about something that is that deeply complex. So here we are. I think one of the things about this complexity is if we invest in practitioner learning, it's going to be really powerful, because that same complexity means that improved practice ripples out through all of those spheres. It's a high leverage place to think about investing in learning. And we have models for how practitioners can think about how to learn about something that complex, whether it's how do I learn and overcome the drama of defensiveness or inability to see or understand, or everything else that is the drama of learning for a practitioner. If it's about building colleague patterns that let colleagues work together and support each other in learning. If it's about the organization itself, if we learn something, can the institution, the learning institution, take it up and spread it and build on it? And how do we maintain a critical perspective about our field? So there are lots of ways to do this. Don't need to necessarily go through them all, but all of these phrases, all of these ways of learning show up across so many different workplace practitioner-led learning spaces that there has to be something to them. They're so ubiquitous when adult learners are in charge of their own learning. So there's something here. And I guess I want to close by saying that as we think about Connected Educator Month, technology can really amplify these ways of practitioner learning. Totally. They're not the same as the learning. And so thinking about how to move the very best of practitioner learning into more spaces, maybe online spaces, is really important. So just to close, I guess some of the points that I hope that we might think about is, can we remind ourselves that connected learning is for adults as well? That being a learner as an adult, it's bigger than just the tools of learning. And if we thought about these traditions of practitioner learning led by practitioners for their own benefit. There's a whole network of people who've been keeping these learning traditions alive. They've interrogated them, they've reflected on them, they've sharpened them, and they're kind of natural allies, I think, in the connected learning movement. We may not think about them that way. They may not all necessarily be focused on technology. They may be much more focused on other kinds of settings, but they know a lot, and they know a lot about adult learning. So we may want to think about reaching out to and learning from them. And then, heavens, I should be stopping, and we should turn this over to a conversation.
Okay, who wants to jump in?
Okay, well, Elyse, so what's interesting about the points that you laid out for me is I couldn't help but the entire time think about how what's challenging is that many of those ideas want to be turned into these reified processes that are really tidy. So, I mean, I know in the resources you put up, for example, things from Susan Lytle, who is really great about cautioning as part of these ideas. And when you're sometimes engaging with an adult group of learners and you're trying to explain to people what you're doing, what they see sometimes is this really messy experience, right? Where people are bringing problems to the table more than solutions, or they're not sure what questions they want to ask. It takes a long time because people feel very fragile when they're presenting these ideas about teaching or their work or their learning. They feel scared to share things that are complicated and messy. And so it's not as easy to say, here's a handout or here's a protocol, and now we're going to develop this learning community around this. I mean, it's over such a long period of time sometimes that you develop those relationships where you can really do the hard thinking. And I think what technology affords, I'd love to hear what other people say about this, is that you can connect with other people over time and always be a public, always be a place where you have other people in the room with you.
Yes, Kim, I agree with you. I think it's important to think about how you build trust with the stakeholders. Can you guys hear me? Okay. How you build trust and how you build trust and sustain the trust over time, because building a community of learners is messy, and it is not tidy at all times. It's not about the protocol, it's about the trust and the collaboration that goes into that. And I'd like to point out one of the points that Elyse brought up, this notion of interest-powered learning when it comes to adults. I don't think that's been entertained a lot in the literature or thought about. And so how do you design experiences for adults that's about their learning and what they're interested in? The inquiry-based model definitely fits into that category. But I think of it in terms of how do you use that concept to motivate people to continue to do the work that we do, because it's hard work, it's challenging. And so I'm really interested in exploring this notion of interest-based learning the same way we think about youth. How do you design those types of learning opportunities for adults?
One of the things that I questioned on one of your early slides, Elyse, was that connected learning is academically oriented. And I understand you clarified a little later, you mean academically in the best sense, but the word has a lot of baggage, and most people's association with the academy is very much of a hierarchical system with lots of power structures and relations, and one where there's a, if anything, you're always reinforcing the dichotomy between the thinkers and the doers. I know you put up Mike Rose's The Mind at Work as one of the references for preparation, and it's one of my favorite books. I just love the way he talks about that, the damage that's been done in our culture from the denigration of workers and their intelligence. And if connected learning can help to redress that, it's harder to make that case when the pitch is framed in terms of things that reference the academy, because the academy is sort of almost by definition removed from most people's ordinary work and life situations.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a very good and true observation. Academically oriented is a phrase that shows up in the model to really hold space for the notion that we need to make it possible in connected learning for people to attain knowledge that counts for them. And that's kind of a placeholder for that. You'll see that, for example, in Connie's talk through of the connected learning model. But I think what you just said is really true. It's one of the reasons why, especially among the educator community, where the model of the academy is often something we're challenged by or fighting against in a way in our own practice. Exactly what you said, that word causes people to bristle. And I think, though, the interesting thing is it's an exact, to me, analogy to those models of the workplace as well. It is the equivalent. It's the thing that we have to interrogate, in effect, to create a different kind of learning environment. And I think the workplace is as well, and its hierarchies. There's always power structures, and there's always knowledge that counts. And there's someone, very much like in the academically oriented side, where people will say, yeah, but kids still need to learn valuable knowledge. There's a manager somewhere who says, well, yeah, maybe I'll make some space for a learning group in my workplace or in my school, but are they really going to be following something that's going to add up to improvement in this workplace? Or are their interests going to take them all over the place? And you can picture the same thing we say of kids. So how is the study of X that they're interested in going to help our Y? That's a workplace question, and it's also a question people ask about schools.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with a question from the live stream, but before doing that, I wanted to note that I was reminded of Doug Engelbart.
Improvement infrastructure.
Yes, exactly. Yes. I mean, all of the technology we're using today, he really had a plan for organizations, learning organizations, as well as workplaces. He talked about type A, B, and C knowledge. A is how do you make the widget that we sell? B is how do we do that more efficiently? But the C knowledge is what he was most interested in, which was how do we improve our ability to improve? And I think that we're getting back to that. The question is not unconnected. The question from the live stream is, does learning in the context that we're talking about here mean mastering content, or does it mean learning a process of problem solving?
I think learning a process of problem solving out of those two, and then also problem solving around problem solving. So I think I know I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be a Zen master. I'm not qualified to do that, but one of the things I think in all these traditions of workplace and practitioner learning of the kind that I've named, it's partially about problem solving, the problems that you solve as a practitioner, but then it's also about a critical reflection on how your solutions need to be rethought or reframed, or create problems that need to be solved. That situation of let's say the young person and the video production and the piece which is very publicly sexist. We can solve that problem, but our problem is we can solve it in ways that create new problems that actually, through critical reflection, we can decide are really not good solutions. We can just stop video production, or we can berate a kid, or we can ignore it and pretend we didn't hear it and let people be comfortable in the space, uncomfortable rather in the space. So those are all ways to problem solve, but how do we get together as practitioners to look at the long-term impact of the preferred solutions in a way that were taken up as a practice, or that society maybe even values, but create other kinds of problems. So I would say it's not only a problem of process of problem solving, it is, and it's a process of reflecting long term on the standard ways in our workplace or our profession we do solve problems and how they actually sometimes need to be rethought.
Yeah, I mean, I think the phrase problem identification is even more important than problem solving. And it makes me think of another challenge we have in this area. Excuse me. This kind of connected learning is also often referred to as peer learning. And being a peer implies a kind of equality. And yet, those structures in the workplace and especially in the academy have hierarchies that make it very difficult for the person who is identified as being lower on that hierarchy to interrogate, to ask a question of someone who is, you were hearing your keyboard, Kim, someone who is on a higher rung in that hierarchy, and the word interrogation itself is also fraught. It has that police connotation of an unpleasant kind of asking of questions. So it's just an interesting bunch of layerings there.
You know, I actually have an example of that, Fred, that playing with this idea of hierarchies. So we designed this big, large writing class, and we invited all these people who want to be future teachers to be mentors in this space. And as you can imagine, there's been a lot of pushback, particularly from the writing community, because you're not supposed to make a writing class larger. And that's a whole other story, and it's working. But what's hard is when you invite the mentors and the 100 students that are in that room to be true participants in that space, and I mean members of that classroom community, and not just about hand raising. Even on the students' end, there's a pushback because they're expecting you to be an expert or to deliver content in a particular way. They have visions of schooling that set them up for that. And then the mentors have to feel some kind of efficacy that it's okay that they're responding to writing or that they have something to say in that space. And boy, is that hard to truly get to a place where everyone can feel like they are a colleague and a peer in a community and have just as much right to post something to the wiki as the instructor, or, you know, come up and demonstrate something in front of the class. And but I think it's the kind of things we need to think about in education if we want to stay relevant, is the place where we invite students and other colleagues into the space with us, so that we start to disrupt some of those things.
You know, probably the easiest way to address that I've found in the classroom, in addition to specifically framing it as saying, yes, I'm the teacher, I know the subject, I'm going to help you learn it, but guess what? You're also responsible for it, is moving the chairs in a circle. I just discovered that accidentally, and of course there's a big tradition with open space technology, but that hierarchy is built into the architecture of the classroom, and if you change that in just that subtle way, and the teacher sits down part of the time and shuts up part of the time, you know, if you shut up long enough, somebody will start talking if you put that expectation on them.
I think an interesting thing often is to look across types of settings. We're all on this, we're all educators on this particular chat, but there are actually some of these very interesting and parallel traditions in other fields. Medicine is an interesting one that's really trying to reinvent, in a lot of ways, how medical practitioners of different types learn about practice. In the bibliography, I put some links to how they're thinking about networking practitioners. There are huge status hierarchies if you think about doctors, nurses, orderlies, technicians, who gets to decide treatment, who interacts face-to-face with patients. This notion that you could involve the client in thinking and problem posing with you, we talk about it as a partnership with students? How can partnering with students in action research or inquiry help us learn? The partnering with the patient is a very interesting thing. The kind of the distance between those models and the authority distance is even way stronger, I think, in many cases than in education. And it's interesting that some of these still very messy and hard to achieve patterns are there in that field for people to learn. Nurses do inquiry and action research. Networked improvement teams define problems to work on. The process of the M&M conferences, mortality and morbidity conferences that doctors do, where they take a case where unfortunately a patient was lost and walk through the whole thing as a case study to identify areas for improvement that they would have to tackle together as a profession. And that is no one single responsibility, the doctor, the nurse. It's actually how the system did or didn't serve this patient. And so it's interesting to me, these same issues, they're not just in education, they're actually across professions, let's say. Practitioners who have a kind of certified expertise that is part of their entitlement to a role. And I know, Tanae, you're nodding because you see these issues with mentors, and your role also as a supervisor all the time.
Yes, you read my mind. And I was just thinking how this plays out, you know, in different spaces like the library with you have different adults, you know, mentors, librarians, cyber navigators, and they all ultimately work with youth. And the goal is to support their development as digital youth. And how do you ensure that this hierarchy doesn't play into the work that, you know, that the work that goes into working with youth, and you know, as the support person, how do you ensure that people are getting what they need? But most importantly, that everybody that plays a role feels like they're a part of a team, and that people are collaborating and problem identifying and problem solving together around some of the problems of practice that come up in and around the space. And then how do we ensure that, you know, we are making, and the reality is the youth, the kids that are in the space, they see everybody as mentors. They see everybody as people that support them. And so it's been a work in progress for us to ensure that we are addressing, you know, and making sure that there's some sort of feel of community and collaboration with these different constituents and different adults in the space.
So to build on that, thinking about community and how that works with the National Writing Project, I was thinking about my experience as a public school kindergarten teacher and coming into the National Writing Project and finding this, you know, community that really valued me, valued what I had to say as an early childhood educator. And then, you know, I think maybe that was like the first part, and then the next part was the sort of critical reflection on the hierarchies didn't just like magically disappear, you know, but they were still there around us. And the people in the writing project gave me the space to figure out like how to articulate the like an awareness of how those hierarchies were playing out in, you know, my school or in the university, and then how to figure out how to negotiate them as a teacher, and then how that could work for my students too.
I've got another question from the live stream. If you'll hang on a second here, I'll get that. So how does connectedness offer something different than the characteristics that Elyse offered in the first two slides of the sequence?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question because I don't have those slides in front of me, but one of the things that this whole conversation makes me think about is, again, questioning the relationship and interplay between digital or virtual connections and face-to-face connections. That is, there's an association of connected learning to computers and networking, and yet we're also talking in the writing project for years before any of that came on the scene about doing connected learning and peer support work as part of our inquiries. So in what ways does adding the digital dimension enhance, detract, complicate, or derail these processes?
Well, I do think the platforms can offer like another, so I think a lot about participation, and so I do think digital platforms can offer just another way in, obviously for students or for the adults you're working with, to find a way to be a member of that space, especially for people who are really intimidated speaking in front of a new group or a group that they feel like they don't have the same kind of agency as, you know, in these hierarchies. That sometimes what those digital platforms do is give you a place to actually blog or post or to ask those questions. And so I really like that in teaching, and I certainly like that working with other professionals, that there can be another place to get your, you know, your thoughts out. And again, you know, I don't think we can, and one of the things that makes the National Writing Project so successful is the combination, obviously, that you learn about each other through Twitter or their website or the way we connect on digital or those kinds of places, and then we can come together and we meet those people. But it is certainly a weaving in the National Writing Project and this great way to spread information really fast. Yeah. And at least I don't know how that happened before.
It did, and there are some very interesting models of it where people have taken historic looks at things like, to use the phrase, working men's clubs. They were often for men, where information was shared, where people would read aloud from even before workers maybe had a level of literacy that let them interrogate, let's say, a whole bunch of literature that might be interesting for them and their thinking. So it did happen, but I guess I'm thinking, and I'm sorry, I had to, I was frozen, I had to unfreeze a bit. As I understood the question, I think there's some really interesting affordances, and they're distinct, I think, affordances from technology. Some of them don't get talked about a lot. I think one is the way that technology can help us capture practice. So this isn't necessarily online, internet connected, but I want to give like a shout out to what it might mean to record a conference with a student, either in video or audio, and then later in the quiet of your own time, be able to listen to it. And for the first time, hear yourself and really hear the questions you ask or the responses you make. It's very hard to hold those things in memory, and so this kind of recording or cross-observation that people might do, or they might use Skype or something like that if they're at a distance, I think is huge for practitioner learning, just to capture. So that's, I think, one affordance. Another one is the way that it gives us production tools. Maybe it's just a matter of blogging on a regular basis, our questions about our practice and our thinking about our practice, but it holds them, much like a notebook would pre-internet, but it lets us go back and see a train in thought that you can't hold on to in memory. So there's nothing like being able to go back a year ago and see how you framed a problem or talked about a young person or understood something, and see where your thinking has shifted and make problematic your own understanding, because now it's external to you. Technology helps us do that. I think it helps us find colleagues and affinity groups. One of the challenges for a practitioner, if you're in an organization that really doesn't support it, doesn't treat you as a learner or let you experience colleagueship, is you may feel extremely alone or even competitive with others in your space about your practice. So being able to find people and not feel alone and share ideas, shop talk to more critical reflection is huge and empowering. I think that the challenge then often becomes if you have soulmates in your affinity group, does that lead you away from action in your own space in some ways, because you're able to kind of feel your collegeship here. So how do you bring that back in to your own space? It might be that through these platforms or other opportunities, we learn ways of being together that are kind of reculturating us to a learning stance, or an inquiry stance, and that's what we bring back. Not so much the tools or techniques, but the feeling and the kind of embodiment of being a learner. Bring that back into our workspace and let that be kind of infectious, let's say, reculturating some of our spaces. Because I think there's very few, I think there are very, very few workspaces of any sort, even when they say that they want to be a learning organization, that have really figured out how to both support learning at all levels, and then how to have the organization learn from people's growing knowledge at all levels, up and down. So there's a kind of reculturation of administration and management too that needs to happen, which some companies, there's some interesting companies that are really trying to work that way, but they're few and far between. There aren't a lot of models for what it means to manage or administer in a way that takes worker intelligence and problem solving and knowledge making really seriously.
I think also too the thinking about connecting workers or outside of their specific locations. I mean, there's a long history of workers connecting for activism, and there's all kind of possibilities on the internets for that happening too. And I'm hugely interested in that and how public discourse happens on the web and for teachers particularly. And I'm also always, wondering like, what things are still being erased or who's still not having a voice or having access. So I keep asking myself those questions, what's new here and what's the same, and what's the history, and particularly thinking about a history of workers and having a public voice.
Yeah, Danae was highlighting that phrase, reculturating spaces. This is a discussion that came up in our Third Space conference in St. Louis, where we were talking about bringing schools, university, museums, and galleries and other cultural institutions in the community all together in collaborative spaces, and creating an atmosphere and a culture of collaboration in a school situation. For one thing, it's a powerful way to remake the culture of the break room or the teacher workroom, where so often the tone of the conversation is commiserating about how miserable this or that situation is, rather than taking advantage of the fact that here you are in a face-to-face peer group, and you could be collaborating, you could be sharing how are we going to transform this, rather than just complaining.
So today that's part of, I'm just wondering if you want to share a little bit about how that's happening in DYN and in the library space, because I think under this theme of reinventing institutions, certainly people who've been watching these broadcasts would have an image of the U Media space, and there's a part that's about rebuilding the building and remaking a number of things, but there's also kind of reculturation piece that you've been working on.
Oh, sorry. Well, it's interesting because as I hear you talk about institutions and this notion of reculturating, I've been also working with other institutions across the city of Chicago, specifically folks that are interested in sort of doing this U Media-like work. And of course, their biggest challenge is existing in these traditional types of institutions that, museums, as an example, where, kids aren't welcomed in these spaces. They're not embraced. They can't touch anything when they come into space. And so how do we think about reimagining these spaces so that they are more appealing, if you will, to youth? And I think one benefit to the downtown Harold Washington space is that it is separate from the library. So, and that's that's something that even in the library branches, the U Media branches in the other library spaces, they're not. And so there is this constant sort of tension, that exists, but within the U Media space, it's the idea where the library staff and their programming is integrated into the U Media way, if you will, and how the library staff and the digital staff and come together to create programming that represents all that happens, or some of the things that happen at the library for the traditional audience. And that's in a lot of these spaces, that's a real challenge, because you have to really rethink how you want to engage youth.
Yeah, I'm thinking that that phrase just at the very beginning that so set me off in a good way of what it would mean to reinvent our institutions. There's the work that's sort of the idea space, like what is the image of, let's say, U Media or of the connected learning classroom or something like that. There's the promotion and extension of those images and inspirations, but the actual work of reinvention is going to be done by actual people on the ground. And I was thinking, as you were talking today, over at another U Media Center art lab, one of the things that they were thinking through in their own worker learning, professional development learning process was how to have an engaged process of the mentors and the security guards. These are people who would not normally be in a classic training together, but the security guards in the space are as significant for the experience of the young people, maybe in some ways more significant than the administration, than some of the mentors might be. How do you create a learning community where people can start to rethink their jobs and their support of youth across roles that are so different, including the real burden that the securities have to protect the Hirshhorn Library and its precious collections. So they can't not do that. They have to do that. But what does it mean to do that job in a way that is supportive of young people and inviting them to be actively engaged in production? That's a huge thing.
Elyse, one of the questions that came up in the live stream is very compatible with what you just said. We just have a couple of more minutes here, but I'd like to throw this question out. What do you think is the critical first step for reimagining a culture of participatory learning working in typically hierarchical environments? And you just gave an example. But what do you think is the critical first step? Is there a critical first step in doing that?
Crew, jump in.
I think it's what Elyse just said. I think the critical first step is an invitation. It is. I mean, who doesn't like to be like? It's what Tanae was just saying about museums being a place where come in, we invite you in, touch things, do things, or asking a security guard, be a part of this space with us, or inviting other teachers. Who doesn't like to be invited? So I actually think that's a huge part of it, is to, instead of just like, we're gonna do this, would you like to do this? Wouldn't this be cool?
I think it's also about bringing, if you think about that hierarchy, middle management, upper management, it's really engaging them in conversation and allowing them to see examples of what a reimagined space looks like, and a reimagined space for learning, and so that there's an opportunity to sort of unpack and disrupt the traditional types of learning and thinking and existing that we seem to experience today, and that youth experience. So I think there's it really engaging others who may not have a sense of what it means to reculturate spaces and people and ideas.
So we are at the end of our hour. This has been a really rich one. There is a web page that puts together the recording of the video, the very rich chat that's been going on in the live stream, and the Google Doc that the people in the live stream have been using for collaborative note-taking, and we can continue this discussion there in the comment thread, and I invite you all to do that. Our next session will be Tuesday, August 21st at 10 a.m. with Karen Cator, discussing the progress of and insights from Connected Educators Month. So thank you, Elyse. Thank you, respondents. This has been, as always, a really rich interchange, and I hope to see you all here again sometime soon.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.
Thanks, Howard.
Thanks. This was fun.